Interesting.
Okay. All right, Rabbi, I got a question for you. Could you explain to me what rabbinic actually is and why?
The most important thing I could say, nowhere in the Talmud or in the Mishnah does it explain it. It doesn't explain it within rabbinic literature what rabbinic literature is and what authority it has. It's just not there.
It's like asking Rav, where is orthodoxy found in Torah? Where?
No.
I mean, it's like the same thing. No, I mean, it's
No.
modern
He's
day.
asking the rabbinical, i.e., anything outside of the Torah that carries weight. Where is that explained? How do we understand it? How do we teach it? How do we keep it? That is not taught in rabbinic literature. And I think that's probably going to be the most educational, the most life-changing thing that you guys are going to learn today. Because with the confidence that we hear rabbis teach the oral law, you would assume that it's found somewhere in source material in terms of hierarchy, in terms of who do we poskin by, which rabbi outweighs what other rabbi. This is not found in the Mishnah, which means that in terms of what we find in Torah and what Jewish history could teach us, your guess is as good as theirs. The biggest litmus test is what keeps the Torah's integrity intact better. That's all we have. That's the test. It's not how long your beard is. This is why I'm not a fan of people commenting on Facebook. I responded to my friend Rabbi Hamavadia's post about going to the mikveh. Now, because of the coronavirus, women aren't able to go to the mikveh. Technically, they could go to the mikveh. They could go to the beach, but I guess maybe up north it's too cold. I don't know. So then he suggested maybe women should go to a bathtub. I had an issue with that. The halakha doesn't really give a way for women to use technically a bathtub, but then I laid down a principle that I mentioned before that I never heard many rabbis say, that if you're not able to keep something in a rabbinic fashion, you should at least make an attempt to keep it from a Torah perspective. This is something that the rabbis today never make a distinction of, but halakha constantly does. If you read the Rambam Mishnah Torah straight through, he'll make a distinction between a Torah law and a rabbinic law. When was the last time you heard of you two rabbi make a distinction between a Torah law and rabbinic law? Never. Why? Because they say rabbinic is Torah. They'll say on Mount Sinai 2 Torahs were given. You see the dumbification of Judaism? The rabbis always made a distinction.
What's the Torah? What's the Torah mitzvah in regard to a woman in Nidah? Would she just take a shower? Are you saying?
No. Well, in terms of the 5 books of Moses, the Torah never mentions a mikvah for a woman in Nidah. The Torah only mentions separation. The rabbis introduced the notion of water, but the distinction between the Torah law and the rabbinic law is regarding the notion of a mikvah. According to Torah law, any body of water constitutes a mikvah, whether it's in a bathtub, whether it's in a swimming pool, whatever. The rabbis instituted that it should be a body of water, of natural water, of at least 40 sah. So 40 sah is the measurement. There's different disagreements on it, 180 gallons, 80 gallons. It's not for sure on how much it is. I think people go by the stricter opinion.
Well, if it said water and they explained that it, look, it'll be this much, but why would they add something? And I have to say that they added something that wasn't even there. Even though it may represent cleansing, it's still not in Torah. Why would they do that?
Because they had to give an answer. Because I used the word rabbi. If I would have said the judges or the elders in the time of Moses, then that pill would have been easier to swallow. But when I say rabbis, that you think of rabbis today just being jerky. There had to be a consensus on what was enough water for you to dip yourself in. So forget about the nida thing, because the nida, in terms of dipping yourself, is not in the Torah. But regarding any type of mikvah, how much water had to be contained in the ashes of the red heifer? There had to be a minimum. This is what they were trying to facilitate. This is how you run a country. Or if not, someone could just sprinkle themselves, just like the Catholic Church does, and said, oh, I'm considering this baptism. So there has to be a standard. Now, there is no standard, let's say, in Christianity. When John the Baptist was baptizing people, he did it in a river, right? So I think the most idyllic way for Christians is in a river. It's fluid, really. How can a Christian really disagree with the Catholic Church who believes in sprinkling or just dunking the way they dunk children? They can't. Because one, they're free of the law, of any law that makes their walk with God difficult. But I think the best answer is that an answer had to be given, and the rabbis decided on that number. Now, I think 40 sa is really not that much water. And back then, the notion of indoor plumbing wasn't so prevalent, although we have found aqueducts in the Roman Empire. Now, if there was another Sanhedrin, I'm pretty sure they would change the law. But because they ruled that into existence, then that's why it stays. But it's not that they were necessarily trying to make life difficult. I mean, nowadays it's difficult because we have swimming pools, we have spas in our house, right? But back then they weren't asking the question. Even today, if you have a hole in the ground and it rains and it fills up with water, that's a kosher mikvah. You're assuming there's no leaks. If it's not seeping into some reservoir or something, that's a mikvah. The notion of mayim chaim, water coming from a natural spring, that's a mikvah. A spring in a cave, that's a mikvah. It's kind of hard not to have a kosher mikvah. Just nowadays, we have water being piped through holes in the ground called swimming pools. The piping of the water, some say, is questionable. The Rambam, he explains that many people in his time, the rabbis of the West, in his opinion, I think they were Ashkenazi rabbis, said that was allowed. And I have a diagram on my website that shows you can have a kosher mikvah just by basically getting a hose and building a mound of dirt and letting it trickle into a pool. This would be instead of waiting for it to rain, because it's kind of hard to fill a swimming pool up only when it rains. What if you live in Southern California or something?
Okay, I'm not trying to be frustrating, but it's not in Torah, so why would you have it in the oral law where you have to keep it? I mean, it's like it's added to Torah. And I don't understand where they went so far to say, well, you need baths, so it's so much water, and it just moved over all the way to, okay, you have to dunk in so much water, and people are more concerned about how much water you need to use instead of why is it there in the first place?
Right, I understand the question. Rabbinic law is broken up into different segments. This is not a ruling by the Sanhedrin. This is an interpretation of a pasuk, of a verse in the Torah. They interpret it to mean that. And there's a lot of portions like that, even meat and milk. There's interpretations that are authoritative of the Torah. This is what we call midrashei halacha. It's portions of Torah being interpreted to mean something. There's a consensus. It's not one person interpreting. It's the greatest scholars of that time, the members of the court, saying that this is what that actually means. Now, they're studying these texts in the Hebrew, and they're saying, using the notion of drash, taking concepts from different portions of the Torah, they interpret this to mean that. And that also becomes binding. Now, we can differ with that, and I'm not sure how they came to that conclusion, but that is where the notion of water for Nida was introduced. It wasn't a ruling just to make life difficult. They actually interpreted the Torah to mean that. Here, for example, the Rambam also interprets people having to go to a mikvah to convert, because there's a statement in the Torah that before they went up to Mount Sinai, they washed their clothes. And with the Hebrew, he breaks down that means that they also immerse themselves. It's not his opinion. He's quoting the same notion of midrashei halacha, these interpretations of scripture that the elders put consensus on. And really, if everyone was meant to understand scripture on their own, and mind you, nowhere in the Torah does it endorse self-study of Torah. Why? Because the law is for a nation. That means everyone has to keep the law the same way. Now, tzitzit is not as complex as we have it today, although there are many different types of tassels that you could put on your garments. But there had to be some consensus on how this is done. And if someone went outside what the consensus was, he had to be re-educated, because you can't have people doing their own thing or going by their own interpretations.
Now, I always encourage self-interpretation of the ethical or even the narrative. But in terms of how we keep Torah law in the collective, there has to be a consensus.
So yes, I think that it makes things more difficult to require water for Nida, but the rabbis interpreted that. I haven't even looked into what verse or what word in Torah they implied meant water. You're just like afflicting yourself on Yom Kippur. Nowhere in the Torah does it say to fast on Yom Kippur. But if you go into the Psalms and if you go into many different other books that use the same word, it implies fasting. Now, if someone only stuck with the Torah alone, they'd make that argument. Why do I have to fast on Yom Kippur? But the rabbis, the judges, the elders back then knew enough to go into many other books to build consensus on what Israel's going to do. If not, one person would have fast, another person wouldn't fast. You understand? It seems hard for us in a Gentile world, but in Israel, when everyone was keeping these laws in a unified manner, it made more sense. And that's really how Torah was meant to be kept. Not just necessarily in the land of Israel, but the land of Israel is supposed to expand to encompass the whole world.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It does make sense logically, though, when you break it down, that water would be used for a purification process. I mean, if you're bleeding, right, and you have blood, or you want to convert, or you want, you have the discharge for a man.
No, but logic is not enough. That's the thing.
Right.
I understand. There are things that the rabbis ruled into existence that make absolutely no sense to me. But because the ruling body of elders decided, you know what, this is how Israel is going to illustrate this law, I'm for it. Because I'm for order. I've always considered Karaite Judaism just another attempt to disorganize religion. There's always that group who always has to be different. Well, you know what? Repairing the world is a team effort. We have to be moving in the same direction, at least in ceremonial matters. If we can't even agree or come to a consensus on ceremonial matters, how can we ever really enforce the ethical? People make such a big deal out of these small things. We're not saying you could rape on Tuesday and kill on Wednesday. We're talking about ceremonial things. It also makes perfect sense to me. You have blood, a woman, there should be water, just in terms of cleanliness things. And there's many rabbis who do that. They're like, oh, well, all these things are perfectly logical. It's not, the kosher laws to me aren't perfectly logical. Pork tastes good and it's safe if you cook it properly. The Torah says not to eat it. No, there has to be a logical reason. No, that's why regarding Torah, we shouldn't ask why, but just what. Now, regarding rabbinical interpretations of commandments that are binding on all of Israel to keep, we also should only ask what, as long as it's not unethical or it's not going contrary to the Torah. The Torah says right, we shouldn't go left. There's always a handful of commands that opponents of the oral law will use to toss out the whole system. Ceremonial commands really shouldn't be mentioned in such a situation, because how do we keep ceremonial commands? Who the heck knows? Honestly, how do we keep Shabbat? It doesn't tell you how to keep Shabbat. Oh, well, everyone should just rest any way he sees fit. Well, how can you run a country like that? And how can you adjudicate these laws when it says that if you don't keep Shabbat properly, you're put to death? So there had to be some consensus. And we see remnants of such consensus even in the time of Moses.
I just wanted to correct you a little bit, Rav. It was actually Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who told Moses to establish the elder courts. And then Moses says, well, that's a good idea. Maybe I'll ask God. And then God gives him the approval.
That court is not complete. First, it doesn't say anything about elders. He says appoint chiefs to help you judge the people. God is not mentioned there. No command for people to adhere to that court is mentioned either. Just like the notion of prophets is mentioned elsewhere, but only in Deuteronomy chapter 18 are we commanded to listen to the prophets. The scenario with Jethro is more descriptive than prescriptive. In fact, the Rambam in his Sefer Mitzvot, he gives 14 principles on what he considers one of the 613 commandments and why he excluded so many of them. Because he said that if the command was just given to those people at that time, it doesn't constitute one of the Toyag Mitzvot. The command has to be eternal for all generations. And it's Deuteronomy chapter 18 that speaks about that court that rules from the place that God chooses. Now, God chose a few different places. The last place he chose was Jerusalem. And we know that on top of the Temple Mount, that was the court. But yeah, I mean, I got no problem accepting the fact that Jethro came up with the idea first.
Do you do the two ovens, that kind of thing? I mean, you're full on rabbinic.
Most people don't have two ovens.
Okay.
Two sinks, not two ovens.
Or two sinks. But the notion of two sinks is a chumrah. It's a stringency. Now, it's very convenient that in the American household, most sinks are split into two, but that's not required. Even for those who want to be strict, because in Israel, the notion of two sinks is not very popular. What they do is that they put a mat on the bottom of the sink, one for meat, one for dairy, maybe possibly for parv, but that's also not required. I mean, I'm pretty sure that the biggest objections that people have to the oral law are not part of the oral law at all. They're just customs and stringencies that very wacky people introduced into the Jewish community in the name of Torah. And they'll say, oh, what do you mean? This is what Moses did. It's because they don't know. This is why it's so important to study Jewish history. It's almost as important to study Jewish history as it is to study Judaism.